let's linger on
Yeah.
that actually, because I think that is a perfect example of an anywhere policy. Is you talked about anywheres, you define them as people who are comfortable with more rapid social change, uh, don't necessarily connect themselves to a rooted local, national culture and see themselves as free and easy across the world. And so the idea of creating an immigration policy which effectively opens your border up. We've seen in the United Kingdom 650 to 700,000 net per year the last couple of years, but really it's 1.2 million new people and we lose 500,000 elsewhere. And the US has seen millions coming across its
Mm.
southern border. And so when you find people within that second constitution, the media and academia, and lots of people making noises around democracy being in danger because they sense a shift to the right, which is ultimately, from most people's reading, down to the fact that people are disillusioned with the notion that they can't actually make any change to things that matter to them and which they're actually impacted by with regards to access to jobs and services, changing culture. And it's that lockdown of all of the decision making activities by the anywhere folks, and often it can be placed upon economic grounds. So you're not allowed to talk about culture that is seen as to be something that is an unsanitary thing to talk about, I would say, and something which has stopped us from having open policy debates about what kind of a controls you would want on your borders. But let's linger on that, David, because I know you, in your role at Policy Exchange, you're the head of demography, immigration, and integration. So you'll have a view on this. We've often been told that there is a GDP boost from mass immigration, that immigrants will put in more than they take out. What is that true, or is it a myth? What data do we have to suggest whether that argument holds up if we're not able to talk about culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is largely a myth. I mean, well, I mean, just to pull the camera back a bit, I mean, I do think you're right that mass immigration, essentially without consent, is a massive political fact that kind of underlies a lot of political conflict. I think you could even, I mean, because the speed of change is just quite phenomenal. I mean, it's really greater than the United States at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. I was reflecting on this recently in the piece I wrote for the Saturday Times. I did the Saturday Times essay reflecting on the essay I'd written in 2004, 20 years ago, called Too Diverse? At that time, the non-white British, so the properly described ethnic minority population, which would include white ethnic minorities, people from Poland or Romania or whatever. The non-white British population of the UK in 2004 was about, when there was already obviously a lot of anxiety about scale and speed of change. We'd had huge asylum inflows connected with the Balkan wars in the Balkans. We'd had the so-called Milltown riots in 2001. But the ethnic minority population of the UK then was about 10%. It is now 26%. Just in extraordinary change in 20 years. And you could say much of that has been absorbed perfectly happily. You've had a lot of positive changes in many ways. We now have much higher representation of ethnic minorities in the sort of higher professional class and indeed the political class. We have an ethnic minority prime minister. Substantial representation in conservative cabinets in recent years, and for many parts of the country, and for many, particularly the more successful ethnic minority groups, and British Indians, for example. You've had broadly a positive story. People have moved out from the inner city to the suburbs. Many of the kind of flashpoints tend to focus on the Muslim minority and Muslim sensibilities, but in many other respects, I mean, there's a high degree of segregation in the school system, but somewhat less so in where people live. But there are certainly things to celebrate. I think compared to many other countries, we've by both accident and design managed to avoid some of the conflicts that you're seeing in a place like sort of Sweden. But that still has left, I think, a lot of people, not just from the white majority, a lot of ethnic minority people too, thinking that that change has been happening too rapidly. And I think there are kind of two issues that I think, as it were, distinguish a sort of sensible centrist position, you might almost say, on these issues from a more liberal position, which often passes itself as the acceptable majority position. I mean, one is to do with national democracy. I mean, the nation state itself, and the ability of the nation state to prioritize existing citizens over non-citizens. And this rises, this crops up quite a lot in the immigration and the refugee debate. Should people be, and indeed it was, of course, one of the reasons for the resistance to free movement. I think what caused particular dislike of free movement was not so much the numbers of people coming over, although that was obviously a factor too, the economic competition, the lack of, competition for scarce public services and so on and so forth. But it was also the fact that people could come here and be treated in almost all respects as if they were a British citizen from day one, without, as it were, having paid into the system either economically or, one might say, almost sort of culturally. Their grandfathers hadn't died in the First World War. They weren't part of the kind of national story. Of course, they can become part of it over time, and that, it's a sort of foundation stone of democracy, you might say, in its modern national form, is the prioritization of national citizens' rights over non-citizens. And that, I think, is often blurred by more liberal-minded people in the debate, who kind of want to imply, who want to quickly move to a kind of ethnic or racial element, that you're being, you're being racist in effect to decide. I mean, even though we have obviously a multi-ethnic nation, you're being racist to imply that a national citizen should take priority over a non-national, or should even have equal rights to a non-national. And the other thing is just the reason why most people. I mean, obviously there are people who think racially, and who do have a kind of a race bug about some of these changes, but they're a pretty small minority these days. I mean, I think it's something like sort of 4% of people say that you have to be white to be truly British. And the people that sort of think in those terms are mainly dying out. Nonetheless, I think a lot of people will still interpret what I think of as mainly a discomfort about loss of familiarity over rapid change, again, as a sort of racist or a nativist reaction. And I don't think that is usually the case or fair to the people that are feeling that. So that's the sort of broader context. I mean, on the economics, you're right. I think a lot of the justification, going back 20 years or so, a lot of the justification for immigration was that we kind of, we needed to be more diverse. We were too boringly homogeneous. a kind of racial justice argument, atonement for empire, that kind of thing. I don't think people really think like that any longer, that sort of immigration is some kind of moral tonic for the nation. But the kind of the political class, which has remained, very, very strongly in favor of high levels of openness, I think both for economic and cultural reasons, now does tend to justify a high level of immigration in terms of economic arguments. And I think they're on very, very weak ground, particularly since the financial crash of 2007, 2008. I mean, I think there is an argument to say that, obviously in principle, immigration can be an economic benefit. If immigration involves people who are coming here, who are bringing skills that don't exist in the country or couldn't, quite easily be made to exist through the training system. If they're bringing skills that are lacking, if they're bringing, capital, entrepreneurship, if they're coming to do highly paid jobs and they're paying high levels of tax, putting into the system more than they take out, all of those things are clearly beneficial for the average citizen, which is obviously the view you should take when you're judging these things. Obviously, it's beneficial for the migrant coming, otherwise they wouldn't come. They have a choice that the average citizen doesn't have. But no, the economics. We did have a lot of higher paid professionals who probably contributed to the strength of both the financial services sector, obviously one of the country's sort of specialist industries, and perhaps the kind of higher professions more generally, particularly in that boom period, or what now seems like a boom period of the early mid 2000s. Immigration may have made probably not a huge positive impact, but some positive impact. I think the East European migration in general was pretty neutral, actually, because most East Europeans were not in particularly highly paid jobs, and they obviously drew on the welfare state. They may not have been educated here, but many of them had children who were. They often qualified for tax credits and so on, or they were obviously using the health system and other parts of the welfare state. So I think the East European story was a sort of a break-even one. It's true they did often people from poorer countries, often there's a selection process in who comes here from poorer countries, and it tends to be the kind of the more get up and go, more ambitious people, and often they have a strong work ethic, stronger average work ethic possibly than the average British person. So you can see why employers like them. But I mean, the economic argument for migration is essentially one of holding down wages. I mean, the Treasury used to be pretty open about that. It's restraining wage inflation. If you have access to a bigger market, it goes back to Karl Marx talking about the reserve army of labour in Ireland. There was that was, and I think there's been a certain hypocrisy on the part of the economic establishment. Kind of know perfectly well that to the extent that a high level of immigration is an economic boost, it is because it is disadvantaging the existing workforce, and holding down wages and increasing profits, which then lead to kind of higher level of investment. You get into that sort of virtuous circle, but it does require the holding down of wages.
Yeah, that economic impact it has on existing workforce, citizens, residents of a country. I saw another graph, or another data set, should I say, depicted in a graph which showed the rate of internal migration tracked against the rate of incoming or immigration. And what's pretty remarkable is the Blair years hit, and as the numbers start increasing with the numbers of people that are coming into the country, the number of people moving internally start to drop. And in the last 10 years or so, where it's really shot through, and obviously the last 5 years in particular, hardly anyone is now moving internally. And so clearly Britain has a history of, since the Second World War, of we've lost industry to globalization. We are now focused on the Southeast. Lots of people have been tempted to move to the Southeast in the past, but increasingly people are not doing so, even if it is the economic engine, because the housing supply is so low and it's prohibitively expensive. It's very competitive for jobs. And effectively, people would argue, looking at those graphs, that there's a bit of queue jumping going on here to get to the prime real estate, the prime jobs. And so all of this and what it does to social cohesion, when people feel like, despite what they're being told about GDP being a good thing, is it still cutting them off from somehow moving around if they should